Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into Victor Davis Hanson's The Other Greeks, the family farm and the agrarian roots of Western culture.
Ah,
And this really isn't your typical history of ancient Greece. It kind of flips the script on how we usually think about Hellenic civilization.
it really does. Hansen lays out this powerful argument that the real foundation, the bedrock of ancient Greek society, wasn't so much the big cities or the philosophers or the elites we always hear about.
Right.
No, he points to the independent family farmers, these other Greeks, as he calls them. He argues they're the overlooked backbone, and their daily lives, their struggles, actually shaped almost everything.
So our mission today is to really unpack that perspective. It's fascinating. We'll explore how these tough-minded, practical, fiercely independent farmers, how they instilled values that, well, you could argue still resonate today in Western society.
hmm
And maybe, surprisingly, how really understanding farm life back then can unlock, a deeper meaning in ancient texts. It's a compelling journey Hansen takes us on, showing how this agrarian way of life emerged from the Greek Dark Ages, how it really defined the flourishing city-state period, the polis.
Polis, yeah.
And then how it eventually started to erode, leading to some pretty profound cultural and political shifts. And what's really interesting, you mentioned this, is Hansen himself is a farmer.
Yes, that's key. It gives him this unique, sort of empathetic, practical viewpoint on ancient farming expertise. It's not just abstract theory for him.
Exactly. So with that framework, let's start where Hansen does, really at the beginning of this agrarian story. You mentioned the Greek Dark Ages, roughly 1100 to 700 BC. Now, most historians paint this, post-Bronze Age time as pretty bleak. How does Hansen see it differently, especially through that agrarian lens?
It's a really crucial reframing. I mean, yes, it was a time of impoverishment, fewer resources, population decline, initial, no doubt.
Yeah.
But for the farmers themselves, it was actually a huge break from those, curlier Mycenaean palace economies.
Okay, those really centralized systems.
Exactly. Very top-down, bureaucratic almost. The palace decided a lot about agriculture. Individual farmers didn't have much say. And widespread private land ownership. Pretty much non-existent back then.
Right, so the collapse of that system, paradoxically, opened up possibilities.
Precisely. The Dark Ages, despite the hardships, created the conditions for a really radical transformation in how land was used, how farming was done, driven largely, Hansen argues, by population growth eventually picking up again and just the basic need to feed more people more reliably.
So this isn't just like a slow recovery, it's a fundamental shift. What was the critical change in farming itself? And what was the impact beyond just, getting enough calories?
Well, a huge part was the widespread adoption of permanent crops. Think olives and grapes. Now, this is more than just changing the menu.
Okay.
These crops, they demand long-term investment. You plant an olive tree, you might wait decades for a good return.
Decades, wow.
Yeah, so this long-term view inherently required, and it actively fostered, the idea of clear land title. You needed to own that land securely for the long haul.
That makes sense.
And Hansen actually calls the act of grafting, arboriculture, cultivating trees and vines properly. He calls it a veritable revolution. It wasn't just new crops, it was a whole new intensive relationship with the land, creating capital, essentially, on the farm itself.
A revolution rooted in trees and vines. And this revolution, it didn't just change farming techniques, it changed society. You mentioned the emergence of a Gedrigoi. Who exactly were they?
Right, the Gedrigoi. They were this relatively homogeneous class of farmers, landowners, and what was really novel, historically speaking, was their attitude towards work. For them, farming wasn't just about survival, about subsistence.
It was more than that.
It became seen as an ennobling pursuit, something that built character, defined your identity, ensured your freedom. This link between hard physical labor and virtue was, well, pretty new.
And we actually see a picture of this kind of farm in Homer.
We do. Hansen points to Laertes' farm in the Odyssey as a kind of prototype for this intensive, diversified agriculture. It's described in remarkable detail, actually.
What kind of details?
Things like a specific homestead residence, not just scattered huts. Irrigation systems is a bit about burying a pot of water near young vines. Very practical. Using slaughter labor, which is crucial. Growing a mix of crops, not just one staple. Incorporating marginal land, pushing the boundaries, even processing and storing food right there on the farm.
So it's not just a quaint scene.
Not at all. Hansen argues this is the blueprint. It's the engine, economic and social, that powers the later polis. This kind of intensive farming created the surplus, the capital, the relative leisure time that was essential for all the other aspects of Greek culture we talk about.
It's really striking how dynamic agriculture was, how foundational. Okay, so this new foundation is laid in the Dark Ages. How did these values, this way of life, get embedded into the Greek city-state, the polis, during its classical high point?
Well, those very characteristics of the farmer, that self-reliance, maybe even stubbornness, playwrights like Aristophanes often made fun of him.
Right, the sort of rustic characters.
Exactly. But those traits came to be seen widely as virtues. These farmers were the real producers. They dealt in tangible things, grain, wine, oil not, as they might see it, abstract or paper wealth derived from trade or finance alone.
So there's an ideology developing around farm work.
A very strong one. This idea that strenuous manual labor, working your own land, is directly linked to good character, to prosperity, to being a good citizen. And this ideology supported the rise of what Hanson calls a middling breed.
The misoi or zugitai.
That's them. These are the farmers who weren't super wealthy aristocrats, but they also weren't destitute peasants. They owned enough land to support a family, enough perhaps to afford hoplite armor later on. They became absolutely central to the polis.
In this middling class, they had a specific political outlook too, didn't they? It sounds like they were protective of their status.
Very much so. They championed a kind of egalitarianism, but maybe not quite how we'd think of it today. Their goal wasn't necessarily to level society completely or take land from the rich.
Okay, what was it then?
It was more about cultivating a social ethic and political structures where farms tended to remain roughly equal in size, passed down through families. They really wanted to prevent power, especially political power, from accumulating in the hands of non-agricultural elites, big merchants, aristocrats with huge estates, that sort of thing.
They wanted to keep land ownership spread out.
Exactly. Because land ownership, specifically owning enough to be self-sufficient, became the basis of citizenship itself in many polis. This led directly to constitutional governments, sometimes called timocracies, where your political rights and participation were literally tied to your property value, your land.
And Solon's reforms in Athens, they fit into this?
Perfectly. Solon's reforms were in many ways a formal recognition of these successful middling farmers. They protected family plots from debt bondage, formalized different classes based on agricultural output, cementing the political importance of this landowning citizenry.
That really connects the dots between the farm and the state structure. But let's get down to the brass tacks of what daily life was like on these farms. You mentioned it was tough. What were the actual practicalities? Labor, for instance. You mentioned slaves earlier.
Right, and we have to be clear about this based on the sources. Chattel slavery was essential and pretty much everywhere. Slaves were often acquired cheaply through warfare, seen as booty, and they provided the absolutely crucial year-round labor. Without them, the citizen farmer probably couldn't have both farmed and fulfilled his military duties.
Oh. So slavery was deeply integrated into this yeoman farmer ideal. What about the roles of women?
Generally, women's roles were overwhelmingly domestic, managing the household, weaving, raising children. Some sources, like Hesiod, can sound pretty harsh, almost portraying a wife as just another piece of property needed to run the farm. Seeing women doing heavy field work, that was usually considered a sign of extreme distress or poverty for that family, not the norm for the middling farmer's wife.
Okay. And what about interactions with neighbors? In such a self-reliant culture, were they helpful or?
Well, it was complex. There was definitely a strong sense of self-interest, looking out for your own family's plot first and foremost. And the sources mention a constant background worry about theft of tools, livestock, crops, even boundary markers being moved.
So maybe not always friendly cooperation.
Not necessarily. A good neighbor was valued, sure, but there seems to have been a fair amount of suspicion, too. It reinforced that need to be self-reliant, maybe a bit prickly, and beyond people, you had nature.
The physical challenges.
Immense physical demands. Farming is hard work, plus the constant battle against things you can't control. Drought, floods, frost hitting the vines, pests like locusts. Injuries must have been common too.
So how did they cope with all that uncertainty?
A key strategy was crop diversification, planting a mix of things, grains, olives, vines, vegetables, maybe some fruit trees, keeping some animals. This wasn't about maximizing profit from one cash crop.
It was about resilience.
Exactly. It was about ensuring self-sufficiency, autarkia, the Greeks called it. If one crop failed, maybe others would survive. It also spread the labor demands more evenly throughout the year. It was a calculated choice. Sacrifice potentially higher yields for reliability.
Intense self-reliance, pragmatism, managing risk. It paints a very clear picture. And it's this specific identity, the citizen farmer, that you said directly shaped their military approach.
Yeah.
Let's talk about hoplite warfare.
Right. The hoplite soldier was the farmer, or at least the ideal hoplite was. He was fighting, quite literally, to protect his own land, his own property, his family, his way of life. It wasn't an abstract defense of the state in the modern sense. It was personal.
And their equipment reflected this. The heavy armor.
The heavy bronze panoply, yes.
Oh,
The shield, the helmet, the spear. It was designed for fighting shoulder to shoulder in a massed formation, the phalanx. This emphasized collective strength, discipline, unity, not individual heroic duels like in Homer's epics, though those didn't vanish entirely. It was a kind of technological and tactical response driven by this middling group of farmers needing to defend themselves effectively together.
okay, so the farmer becomes the soldier. What was the actual nature of hoplite battle? It sounds quite distinct from later warfare.
Very distinct. Ideally, hoplite warfare was supposed to be brief, decisive, often fought on level ground, suitable for the phalanx, between neighboring city-states, usually over border disputes or honor.
And timed conveniently.
They tried. Ideally, battles happened during slack periods in the agricultural year, like late summer after the grain harvest but before the olive harvest or winter planting. The whole point was to resolve the dispute quickly and get back to the farm. Lengthy campaigns, sieges, fighting far from home, these were generally avoided or seen as problematic, at least before the Peloponnesian War changed things.
And the leadership was amateur?
Largely, yes. Generals were usually elected citizens, often farmers themselves, not professional military men in the later Roman or modern sense. The military was firmly under civilian, meaning citizen, control. The whole system was remarkably frugal, too.
Frugal. How so?
Well, battle fatalities, while horrific for the individuals, were often relatively low compared to other forms of ancient warfare. The aim wasn't annihilation, usually. And the equipment, it was privately owned.
Right. The farmer bought his own gear.
Exactly. And after a battle, the armor and weapons of the defeated weren't just left to rust. They were often collected by the victors. Spoils of war may be reused, maybe melted down, maybe sold, recycled in a way. It really speaks to the practical, utilitarian mindset of these landowners.
It's an incredible system, really, how this agrarian model built the polis, shaped its values, its military. But you mentioned earlier, its very success contained the seeds of its own, well, transformation or decline. How did this tightly woven system start to unravel?
It's a bit paradoxical, isn't it? The Persian Wars are a major turning point. On the one hand, a massive victory for the Greeks, validating their way of fighting in some ways. But on the other hand,
It exposed the limits.
it exposed the limits of just relying on hoplite farmers and purely local defense. It showed the need for things like powerful navies, longer campaigns, more complex strategies, and crucially, more money than traditional farming alone could easily generate.
And Athens is key here.
Athens in particular becomes what Hanson terms a deviant polis in this respect. After the Persian Wars, it builds an empire, relies heavily on its navy funded by tribute and trade. Its democracy expands to include citizens who don't own land, the rowers in the fleet, the thetes.
So incorporating non-farmers more directly into the state.
Yes, and also relying more on resident foreigners, the medics, and a huge number of slaves in industries beyond farming, like the silver mines. All this diluted the traditional influence of the independent farmer class that had been so central. The interests of the city, the empire, started to diverge from the interests of the smallholder farmer.
So the expansion and, let's say, diversification of the Athenian economy and military began to pull things away from that agrarian core.
Exactly. And this wasn't just Athens, but it was most pronounced there. Across the Greek world, you see the rise of mercenary soldiers who fight for pay, not for their own farm. Professional generals emerge. Warfare becomes more specialized, more expensive. The citizen farmer hoplite in the phalanx, while still important for a long time, gradually becomes less dominant, less decisive on its own.
And economically, things were shifting, too.
Yes, opportunities outside farming, trade, crafts, rhetoric, politics, warfare itself started to grow. Wealth could be accumulated by people who weren't primarily landowners. And over time, particularly after the Peloponnesian War and into the Hellenistic period, you start seeing the consolidation of land again. The growth of large estates, the latifundia, worked by tenants or gangs of slaves.
Almost like a return to something resembling the pre-Dark Age structure.
In some ways, yes, a reversal of that trend towards widespread middling farm ownership. By the Hellenistic era, after Alexander, the ideal of agrarian egalitarianism, that fierce independence tied to a family plot, had significantly faded in many places.
The city-states changed fundamentally.
They became, as Hanson puts it, polis in name only. They might still have had walls and assemblies, but that core character, rooted in the independent citizen farmer-soldier, had largely been lost or transformed beyond recognition. The success of the agrarian polis created a bigger, more complex world that eventually outgrew its original, perhaps confining, agrarian cradle.
So to sort of bring it all together, Victor Davis Hanson's The Other Greeks makes this really powerful case that so many ideals we associate with the West, things like private property, self-reliance, constitutional government, the citizen soldier, they aren't just abstract philosophical concepts.
No, he argues they have very deep roots in the practical, demanding, sometimes harsh but ultimately productive world of the ancient Greek family farm.
It's a really compelling reminder that the very success of that agrarian society, its ability to generate surplus and complexity, eventually led to a world that moved beyond it, causing that unique culture to change and in some ways disappear. Which really leaves us, and you listening, with a rather provocative thought to chew on. If Hansen is right, if the health and character of the ancient Greek polis were so deeply tied to the existence and the values of that independent family farm, what might the ongoing decline of that kind of farming in our own time mean for the values we claim to inherit and cherish? What lessons are there maybe from the Greeks about how we cultivate and maintain our own, perhaps precarious, heritage?